Today, I want to talk about this article I came across the other day written by Aaron Rupar. Want to talk about this for a few reasons, one of which being that Aaron Rupar, he's a journalist with 775,000 followers on Twitter, so this guy strikes me as a heavy hitter, pretty popular guy. As you can see, this tweet has 6,700 likes, 2,600 retweets. And, it's about, student loan crisis, high tuition costs. It's all Ronald Reagan's fault. And I'm starting to sense that this is becoming an increasingly popular talking point amongst the left and amongst Democrats. If you recall, a few months ago, I did a rebuttal video to the Gravel Institute, and their video tried to blame the student loan crisis on Ronald Reagan. If you notice this quote on the screen, this same quote is going to be used in the article we're looking at. So I sense this is going to become a new talking point. You're going to see whenever talking about college, student loans, financing higher education, every problem that we see today with universities, skyrocketing tuition costs, it's all Ronald Reagan's fault, folks. And here's the article. It was put up on Aaron Rupar's Substack, written along with Noah Berlatsky on August 31st, titled, "Biden is Addressing the Root Cause of the Student Debt Crisis, Conservative Ideology." Republicans have spent generations gutting investments in public universities, and students are worse off for it. Article says one of the supposedly good faith criticisms of Biden's student loan forgiveness program is that it does nothing to fix the root problem of high college costs.
You're goddamn right.
As one investment fund CIO put it on Twitter, Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott made a similar complaint, arguing that if we want real solutions, we need to hold colleges and universities accountable to the American taxpayer and responsible for student outcomes. These objections diverge a bit on what the real problem is. Is it high tuition or poor outcomes for graduates? But the general point has a certain ring of truthiness. Loan forgiveness provides relief after the fact. Surely it would be better to put in place policy that would prevent students from going into debt in the first place. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that this pesky root problem is economic, but it is not. The root problem with higher education costs is ideological, and Biden's student loan plan is acting on the principle that helping students is good for the nation. Wow, what do I keep telling you folks? The whole capitalism versus socialism debate, it's not about economics. It's about what's good for the community. It's good for the nation is a solid, important effort to address the political gridlock of neglect and cruelty which has created our higher education crisis. A brief overview of skyrocketing tuition costs. If you want to lower college costs, you need to first ask what raised them. There is more than one culprit, but a big one is massive government disinvestment. In 1964, tuition at four-year private school in current dollars cost about $1,160. Tuition at a public school cost just $261, well within the reach of most middle-class families without taking on much debt. Students could even work part-time and summer jobs and reasonably hope to afford most or all of their tuition. It's interesting that he brings up 1964 without mentioning in this article what happened in 1965. As I point out in another video I did on this topic back in May, titled "Should Biden Forgive Student Loan Debt?" One big thing that happened in 1965 was the passage of the Higher Education Act, which is when the federal government started securing student loans in the name of making student loans more accessible to Americans. Which, as I explained in this video, if you want more in-depth analysis on this video about how this stimulated demand in student loans and college degrees, eliminated a lot of market incentives that often keep prices low for goods and services, as I demonstrate with this chart back in 1950, long before the passage of the Higher Education Act. Tuition at a public university like the University of North Carolina was roughly 4% of the median income. By 1975, it went up to 5%, and now in 2022, it's roughly 20%. And as Rupar rightfully notes, yeah, back then, before 1965, tuition costs were a lot more affordable to most Americans. Interesting that Rupar does not bring this up. Going on to say, but between 1980 and 2020, undergraduate tuition fees, room and board rose 169%. In 1980, a four-year college in inflation-adjusted dollars would cost an undergraduate an average of $10,000 a year. So you already notice that by 1980, college costs had already went through the roof before Ronald Reagan ever took office, without any mention of the Higher Education Act that was passed in 1965. But no. It was all Ronald Reagan's fault, apparently. By 2020, the article goes on to say, by 2020, that number was $28,000. Private nonprofit school costs in 2020 reached a staggering average of roughly $49,000. That is well beyond the means of almost everyone but the wealthy, without significant aid or debt. Private school increases are a result of a number of factors, including administration bloat and the fact that colleges don't disclose aid before acceptance, so students cannot compare. The government also prevented students from discharging loans in bankruptcy, which means colleges have little incentive to make sure students can pay before burdening them with debt. Affordable college for everyone, though, rests on the public system. And here's where the ballooning of college costs paralleled a long-term state disinvestment in higher education. According to Race to the Bottom, state fiscal support for higher education from 1961 to 2019, state fiscal support for higher education compared to taxpayer income fell by 50% between 1981 and 2019. We'll come back to this in a second. Unsurprisingly, disinvestment in public funds has paralleled the increase of student expenses. Over the last 20 years at leading universities ranked by USA Today, private school tuition has gone up 144%, but in-state tuition and fees for public schools have grown by a staggering 211%, from $3,700 in 2002 to $11,600 in 2022. State funding cuts are especially devastating since 86% of higher education direct spending comes at the state level. But Devin Fergus, a professor at Ohio State University, makes a strong argument in the Washington Post that the crisis started not with the states, but with the federal government of Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, backed by a conservative Congress. The Reaganomics of ballooning student debt. Reagan slashed government spending on higher education by 25% between 1980 and 1985. That included $594 million less for student assistance and $338 million less for Pell Grants. Reagan also eliminated low-cost, low-interest subsidized federal loans to those with incomes under $32,000. As Fergus writes, effectively, these changes shifted the federal government's focus from providing students higher education grants to providing loans. So let's think this through for a second. I'm going to get into the numbers of how much colleges make today, but let's just think this point through for a second. Consider that the current student loan debt in the United States is roughly $1.6 trillion. Even sources cited in this article mention this figure, $1.6 trillion. And to put things in perspective, $1 trillion is 1 million dollars. 1 million times 1 million. Now, some people might argue, yeah, well, the 1.6 trillion figure, a lot of that includes interest, as if to say that, yeah, that doesn't mean that all this money is going to the universities and colleges. Okay, fair enough. So why don't we think of a somewhat apples to apples comparison here? Let's say that you took out a mortgage to purchase a house, and after you pay off the mortgage, you will have paid $1.6 million on that mortgage. And let's say you're struggling to keep up with payments because that's a pretty expensive mortgage, which is not inconceivable in a state like California, which, funny enough, the high housing prices in California are actually a result of Ronald Reagan's policies when he was governor of California. Oops. Just in case anyone out there is operating under the mistaken impression that I'm here to defend the honor of Ronald Reagan, I'm not. I know other people will come up in the comment section saying, but Ronald Reagan, he was tough on communism.
Blow it out your ass.
Okay, whatever you guys want to tell yourself so you can still admire your hero. Anyway, imagine you're having a hard time paying off your house, your $1.6 million mortgage. Now imagine that someone like an Aaron Rupar comes along and says, you know why you had to pay so much for that house to the point where you now owe $1.6 million? It's because 40 years ago, the owners of that house, well, they got their government assistance cut by roughly $900. Just to put things in perspective, as if the $900 40 years ago would have made a dent in tuition costs. And now let's look at the numbers. How much are these public universities, how much revenue are they bringing in these days? Because he talks a lot in this article about disinvestments. Ronald Reagan, he disinvested in a lot of these public universities, and that's why tuition costs are going up and up. Is that what the numbers are saying? I looked this up on usafacts.org, which is a website that was put out by Steve Ballmer, billionaire Steve Ballmer. I remember learning about this when he was on Bill Maher's show and how he was working on this new website that just provides facts, just the facts without any political bent or bias or spin on them. And a lot of these facts have to do with education spending. And here's one on public institution revenues. According to this chart, back in 1981, public institutions, public universities, were bringing in about $43 billion in revenue. By 2017, that revenue jumped up to $390 billion a year. 1 year, $390 billion. I don't know, guys. I don't think these universities are really missing out on that $900 million from the early to mid 1980s. And this is based on data from the National Center for Education Statistics, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. You can look into this stuff yourself. The numbers I looked at seem to line up. Here's a chart from 1980 to 1985. As you can see, this is for public universities. Total revenue was $43 billion. Matches what the chart says. By 2018, according to the U.S. Department of Education, public university revenue rose to over $400 billion a year. And I also want to address this point. I meant to mention this in my video response to the Gravel Institute, and I just forgot. Oops. But to drive this point home that this is all Ronald Reagan's fault, they brought up this statistic that the state funding from tax dollars, the percentage of the budget shrunk over the years, as if to imply that the percentage in budget must mean that the funding had been cut. And what I meant to say at the time was this is probably a result of not funding cuts, but other funding revenues increasing disproportionately. And as it turns out, this data bears this fact. As you can see, in 2008, state funding for public universities in the United States went from $68 billion a year to roughly $73 billion a year in 2018. But despite this increase in funding by $5 billion, as you can see, their percentage of distribution actually shrunk from 25% to roughly 18% because other sources of revenue increased disproportionately. It would be like if, say, you had a car payment that was roughly $500 a month and you were making $5,000 a month, so it would be roughly 10% of your income. And then say suddenly one day you got a raise and you were making $6,000 a month. One could say, oh, wow, your car payment has shrunk as a percentage of your income. But you would not conclude from that your car payment went down as a result. So $43 billion to $390 billion. And you can even see the revenue streams. State, local, and private grants went from $21 billion in 1981 to roughly over $105 billion in 2016. Federal appropriations went from $5 billion in 1981. Now it's up to almost $50 billion. Again, the data from the Department of Education bears all of this. That funding has actually went up. And again, overall, roughly over $400 billion a year in revenue for public universities. Meanwhile, as my buddy, the actual Justice Warrior, pointed out in a recent video, a lot of these colleges, they're spending a lot of money on resort-like amenities and luxuries like pools and lazy rivers. And if you don't want to take actual Justice Warrior's word for it, this is actually something that the left-wing comedian Hassan Minhaj talked about a couple years ago, who I'm no fan of, by the way, but he talked about this on his show Patriot Act 2 years ago. Talks about all of these fancy pools and luxury resort-like college dorms that these colleges are building to appeal to richer, wealthier students from richer, wealthier families. Combine this with the fact that these universities are making $400 billion a year in revenue, and we're to assume that the high tuition costs we're seeing are a result of disinvestment? Really? But again, this is how people like Aaron Rupar and the goofballs at the Gravel Institute, this is how they deceive you. Just throw big numbers at you, hoping you won't think about it. Shift goalposts, reframe statistics, hoping you won't notice or think about it. Well, I don't know, guys. What do you think? Do you guys think that colleges are starving? Do you think that high tuition costs are a result of disinvestment when public universities are getting over $400 billion a year in revenue? Anyway, he goes on to talk about Ronald Reagan, and how other Republicans today are responding to Biden's student loan relief. And yeah, I don't think Republicans have been really great on this issue either. At worst, they've made this issue worse with presidents like George H.W. Bush reauthorizing the Higher Education Act and expanding it. At best, they do absolutely nothing, not even discussing how to reform the student loan system in the United States. So I'm going to take the Stephen L. Miller approach, which he calls the Batman Begins approach, and say, I'm not going to kill you, but I don't have to save you. And I think the conclusion of this article really says it all. Biden's popular debt relief program rights some of these wrongs, saying the root of the problem then is not just that tuition is too high. The root of the problem is that the conservatives want tuition to be high because they want to use education costs as a method of social discipline. Again, I don't know this. I'm not a conservative. I can't speak for conservatives. I speak as a radical for laissez-faire capitalism who thinks that education should be fully privatized, especially the financing mechanisms of student loans and college education, even public education. As I've talked about in other videos, you look at some of these public school districts like in New York City, who now spends roughly $28,000 per student per year on K through 12 public education, yet fewer than 50% of their 3rd and 8th graders are below proficient in math, reading, and writing. Oops. But just throw more money at the problem. That will magically make everything better. And also with public education, as we know, public education is the government has given a near monopoly on education throughout the country, making it impossible for the private sector to compete, making it nearly impossible for the private sector to compete with public schools. Isn't it interesting how in the history of capitalism, when we see companies like Standard Oil, J.D. Rockefeller, how they're accused of being big, scary monopolies. Woo! How did Standard Oil become such a dominant player in the oil market? They did so by maximizing efficiency, by reducing prices so the masses could afford their product while improving the quality of their product. When that happens, they're a big, scary monopoly that we need to break up, violate their property rights in the aim of creating more competition, putting more competition in the market. Meanwhile, with public education, when government has a near monopoly and we just keep spending more and more money every year, every election cycle, no matter Republican or Democrat, product never improves. And people just still think to this day, well, can't leave this to the free markets. Anyway, they justify that by caricaturing young people as feminized, radicalized slackers who drain the public coffers and weaken public virtue. Biden's student loan forgiveness program, in contrast, is built on the idea that investing in young people is a way to create a stronger and kinder nation. You hear that, guys? This is all about creating a stronger and kinder nation. And apparently the only way to make a nation strong and kind is by forcing everyone to be kind. Forcing everyone. We're going to force you to pay for your neighbors' higher education so that they can eventually make more money than you. And because the voluntary financing mechanisms are out, now colleges have no incentive to compete for your dollars by either reducing prices or offering a better product. And if you question any of this malarkey, well, then you're just a selfish jerk that wants the less fortunate to suffer. If you question any of this, maybe what we'll do is we'll dig up records of you receiving government assistance after the government destroyed your business, as we've seen the White House Twitter account doing, which has been met with thunderous applause from their supporters. Remember, guys, don't make me tap the sign. Either way, it's not about economics. It's about forcing you to sacrifice to make the nation stronger than it was before. Doesn't that sound wonderful, folks?